Welcome to Flora and Friends, your botanical cup of tea, a podcast for plant lovers of any kind. We welcome guests to our botanical tea break to explore the history, science and meaning of plants for our lives. My name is Judith Lundberg-Felten. I'm a plant scientist, university researcher and founder of Flora-L Design, and I'm the hostess of your botanical cup of tea. A warm welcome for a new episode of the Flora and Friends podcast. And how could I name the Flora and Friends podcast Your Botanical Cup of Tea if we would not also speak about tea? So here we go for a series of episodes about tea, from its history, biology to how we use it today. Tea is a topic with many different layers, from the botany of the plant to the many ways the tea plant, Camellia sinensis, is picked and processed to give rise to black and white and green and oolong tea. Another fascinating side of tea is its history. Before the 1600s, this everyday intoxicant that we now are so familiar with, like coffee and tobacco and sugar and cocoa and tea, they were not at all present in Europe. But today we are just consuming them every day, and they are not just part of our common diet, they are also, in some countries, a social institution. Like in Sweden, for example, we have fika, where we have coffee and tea and maybe some biscuits, but you have the English 4 o'clock tea as well. You have tea houses and coffee houses where you go and meet different people. So a lot of our life is actually going around these intoxicants, like we can call them. But back to the tea. Today I want to take you on a time travel back to the 17th century Europe, but also Asia, and to understand how the trade and smuggling of tea led to the tea being brought from Asia to Europe and what it did to society here. With me I have Hanna Hodacs and Annika Windahl Pontén from the Department of History of Science and Ideas at Uppsala University. Anna has conducted research on the trade and consumption of tea, and she has also authored a book called Silk and Tea in the North. And Annika has investigated the relationship of the Linnaeus family to tea and how Linnaeus tried to grow tea here in Sweden. So I'm very happy to have them here today. I hope you will enjoy the podcast. If you do so, feel free to share it and to give it a positive review so that more people can find it and can go with us on the travel back to the times when tea wasn't so common. I say very welcome to Annika and Hanna, and I hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome, Annika and Hanna, to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Did you brew yourself a cup of tea?
I did, or my husband did actually, for me.
I did this morning.
Mm-hmm.
Always.
Was it a green, a black, a different one?
Black tea.
Me too. I very much prefer black tea.
I'm team green tea. And I like to have the variations of many different green teas, but not so much with flavor in it. It's just like how it was picked and processed. Let's go into our subject for today. We are talking about tea, and I thought to direct some questions to Hanna in the beginning to bring us back to the time when tea was new or was establishing in Asia, to know how this happened and what we know about tea in the Asian culture before it left this area of the world and traveled to other parts.
Tea has a very long history in Asia, and if you look at the myths, they say tea drinking goes back to 5,000 years back in time. But if you look at more modern history, it's suggested that tea was a fairly common crop in the Tang dynasty, 4th century to 8th, 9th century China. That's where we find the first examples of widespread cultivation of tea shrubs and harvest, and also, we assume, a fairly common consumer habit of consuming tea. And having said that, it's also worth pointing out that we're in China, but and tea spread, but only in a quite limited way. So we have tea consumption and cultivation in Japan and in Korea. But aside from that, tea wasn't cultivated outside these areas.
Yeah, why did people drink tea? What was the origin of people identifying this as a beverage?
Well, it's associated with Buddhism and meditation and staying awake, which it accidentally is the same thing actually with coffee in Muslim cultures. So we have, like tea and coffee, they both contain caffeine. Of course, that was only identified as an active ingredient in the 19th century, but everyone noticed that you were able to stay awake and alert after having had tea or coffee. So it has religious connotations, but we also know that as it became widespread across cultures in the Indian Ocean, like for example on the Indian Peninsula, we find merchant communities there drinking tea regularly.
So it was quite of a widespread use of tea in all kind of parts of society.
Yeah, I don't have numbers on it, but we have accounts, for example, by early European merchants who traded in Indian Ocean and who sort of makes observation about tea drinking. So European sources sort of identify tea drinking in medieval periods in around the Indian Ocean.
Mm-hmm. And back in these days, we didn't have tea in Europe. We didn't have coffee. We didn't have chocolate. What a sad life, you could say. So how did the tea arrive in Europe? And who brought it here?
Well, tea becomes a very important trade goods in the 18th century. But of course, already earlier on in the 17th century, we find the first signs of tea in Europe, and it made its way to Europe on ships belonging to the different East India companies. And at this time, there were two major companies operating in Europe. That was the Dutch and the English East India companies. And they worked in slightly different ways. So the Dutch East India Company was by far the largest and dominated the trade. It centered much of its operation in today's Indonesia and Batavia, today's Jakarta. And this is also the place where Chinese merchants brought goods, including tea. So tea started to arrive in great quantities to Europe with the Dutch East India Company. The English East India Company had most of its bases on the Indian Peninsula, from which it started to import tea, again brought to India with different merchants. The turning point in the trade where it really started to take off was around 1700, when direct trade with Chinese ports were established. And over time, the main port in this context was Canton, Guangzhou, that the Qing dynasty, they only invited European traders to use this port as their main port. And it's in Canton or Guangzhou that we see the really sort of big trade with tea developing. And that starts around sort of from the 1720s, it takes off. It's very much competition between different East India companies. By this time, we also have a French company and a Danish and a Swedish company that also starts trading directly with Canton.
What was the value of the tea then? What did people trade it against? Did they buy it for money, or did they trade it against other goods?
This was the problem with the East India trade from a European point of view. Europeans had very little to offer Chinese merchants in return for the goods that they were interested in. So Europeans wanted, aside from tea, they wanted porcelain, they wanted silk textiles, among other things. But these were the three main important sort of goods. The Chinese merchants were less interested in European goods, but what Europe could offer was silver. And from this point of view, we're looking at this, we can see this as part of a global trade, because most of the silver that was sort of floating around in Europe had come from America and from Peru, for example, where Spanish invaders and colonizers had been able to exploit and extract silver with the help of indigenous population. This silver was brought to Europe and then again brought to Asia and to China particularly, and was used to trade these goods with.
I imagine this time to be very rough. It took a long time for people to transport things by sea. How long would it take from China to Europe for a boat to arrive with tea? And how did the tea need to be like wrapped so that it would be good? What kind of tea actually arrived here?
This is all maritime trade. What develops is a very regular type of trade where ships would set out from Europe in December, January, February, and then they would go down sort of westward towards the Brazilian coast, pick up winds that would bring them down around Africa in time for the monsoon winds that would bring them up in sort of northeastern direction. And then they would arrive to Guangzhou in August, September, and they would spend the autumn having the ships loaded with goods to leave again then around Christmas and arrive back in Europe in the summer. So all in all, it took regularly between 18 months to 2 years to make this return journey. And the main type of tea that was traded at this time was a black quality called bohea tea. It's the cheapest of the teas. And again, it says something about the extent to which tea had become a very popular, very sort of common consumer goods in Europe. So it's a low quality black tea that makes up between 85 to 90% of all the tea that's brought to Europe. And typically bohea tea was packed in large boxes. And in fact, it's interesting because the size of the tea boxes become like a standard measurement. So if you move house in England, where most of the tea ended up, you have sort of removing companies offering you boxes that are the size of the tea boxes that were used at least in the 19th century. So the cheapest kind of tea arrived in these huge boxes, but more exclusive, more expensive tea was packed in smaller boxes and in small metal boxes. So depending on the value of the tea, how exclusive it was, then that decided how you packed it. But it was an enormously sort of big logistical sort of operation to trade with so much tea. I looked at the Danish and the Swedish trade with tea, and I found, so if you take these two companies who between them supplied about a third of all the tea that arrived to Europe in the 18th century, if the year that they together brought in most of the tea, it constituted around 800 tons of tea, most of it black tea. So if you were to put all those boxes on top of one another, they would have reached up in the sky up to, I think, 22 times the Eiffel Tower. So this gives you an idea about how much tea arrived to Europe.
That was a lot of tea. And you mentioned when we talked a little bit before starting the recording, the maritime route was not the only way of tea to arrive to Europe. There was another way of tea travel and tea trade.
Yeah. So the maritime route was the one that, well, it's sort of important to realize how complex the trading world of the Indian Ocean was, and the sort of South Chinese Sea. This is an area of the world where a lot of trade did take place on the sea, on sea routes. But of course, there was also other forms of land-based trade, and we know about the Silk routes connecting sort of China to the Middle East and to Europe, going back many thousands of years. If you look at particularly at tea, this was also transported on the many routes that we together, and only since the sort of late 19th century, call the Silk routes. But in this case, you could obviously bring much less tea this way if you had to carry it, but it also meant that the tea was processed in a different way. So here we find examples of what's called brick tea, which is highly condensed sort of bricks, the size of bricks we used to make houses from, that was sort of that people could carry. So in contrast to the loose tea that was put in chests and brought onto ships, this was highly compressed tea that then you could take a little bit off and you could sort of boil it in water and produce something that, that was another version of tea. We can also see how, just by looking at the different names for tea, how tea moved. So in countries which have been trading tea on the maritime route, as well as in countries where you buy tea that's been traded on the maritime route, tea is called tea. But elsewhere, tea is called chai, and that indicates that the tea has been sort of coming to these cultures and these language areas via the land route rather than the maritime route.
That's very interesting. Why did that happen? Is this because it has traveled through different countries where it got a different name?
Yeah, I mean, that's the assumption, that so the goods, the name would travel with the goods, and if it used different routes, then you could see a diversion in the nomenclature. Having said that, I think Portugal is the only country which used chai for tea. But Portugal, of course, was the first European country to establish trade in the Indian Ocean world. So thus, perhaps, that we have this connection between the name, a different connection between the names and the roots.
What happened to Europe and to European society when tea and also coffee arrived to Europe? How did people perceive this? Who were the people drinking tea, and did they need to to learn to brew it? Did they all already like it immediately? What do we know about that?
Well, tea initially, as well as coffee and chocolate, by the way, were reached Europe in the early modern period. Initially, it was an elite drink, beverage. It was also introduced in many contexts as a medicine. So it had medical connotations. It was used to cure different types of illnesses. This famous Dutch doctor called Cornelius Bontekoe, who highly recommended tea as the medicine that would cure every disease, basically. Some people suspect that he'd been paid off by the Dutch East India Company because he recommended people to drink up to 10, even more cups of tea every day. And of course, this was the type of consumption that only very rich people could afford. And it's also within a context in which, relatively speaking, only very little tea actually existed in Europe. But with these massive trade that developed as direct trade was established with China, and by a growing number of East India Company, tea became accessible and quite cheap. And it takes off, tea consumption takes off, particularly in the Dutch Republic and in Britain. And we can explain this in different ways. When it comes to Britain, it's important to realize or take into account the way that tea was taxed, but also how the market for tea worked. So the English East India Company, has most of the companies operating, trading with Asia, they had a monopoly over goods that were brought from Asia to in this case, Britain. So they were the only one that were allowed to trade on a wholesale basis with these goods. And as British consumers became sort of developed this thirst for tea, the British authorities realized this is a great revenue for tax. So they made it mandatory for the English East India Company to keep a year's worth of consumption of tea in store in London because of the fiscal revenues that this sort of provided the British state with. Some people say that this income for the state financed the British Navy, which expanded greatly in the 18th century. So there is a connection between tax system and sort of why certain cultures, certain countries drink more tea than others.
Does that explain as well why we are more coffee drinking country here in Sweden? That how did the tea come to Sweden, and why did it seemingly not have a real chance against coffee?
It's interesting because Sweden had its own East India Company from 1731 and onwards. And we can see that with the new company, which traded from Göteborg, tea consumption becomes more widespread, as did coffee, by the way. But even in the 18th century, it seems like coffee is the drink that Swedish people prefer. I don't have a good explanation for it. The only sort of way we can use trade routes to explain coffee goes back. You have to go to the 19th century in order to do that, and that is when Swedish merchants brought iron and steel over to America, and then instead of going back with empty ships, they went down to Brazil and filled up with coffee. So from sort of 1840s, 50s, Sweden see a huge sort of import of coffee on ships that do this sort of triangle trade with Brazil. This is also a period when the Swedish economy sort of develops and becomes bigger, so more people can afford coffee. But why Swedish people didn't start drinking more tea in the 18th century is still a mystery to me, and I studied this for quite a while.
Can I just, I mean, even if it was so that they drank more coffee, the difference was not so big as later in the 18th century, if I have understood this correctly. So I also think it is interesting how it happened, or how it developed so that coffee became so dominant, because also bearing in mind that we actually had bans on coffee for some periods during the late 18th and early 19th century.
Yeah, so the government, I mean, if you go by the coffee bans, which were in all 5 coffee bans, the first one in the 1750s and the last one in the 1920s, those bans suggest that coffee was the choice of the people. So yeah, that's a good argument for a good indication that coffee was what people preferred.
When we go a bit to the different types of tea, that may also relate to this, like what taste did people like? We have now today, we can drink white tea and green tea and black tea. Basically, they all come from the same plant. How was that back then in the days? Was it mostly black tea that was transported and that was consumed in Europe? And when did other types of tea, differently processed types of tea, arrive?
Well, there are. So yeah, most tea in the 18th century was black tea, and there is a big price difference between the cheapest black tea, the Bohea tea, and more exclusive green teas. And the reason why black tea becomes popular has to do with the fact that it was easier to transport. So it kept better over, like you could store it for a longer time without it losing its taste. So that's the sort of classic argument for, or explanation for, why black tea was what Europeans preferred. But there was always a sort of an more exclusive market for green teas in Europe. And you can see initially when tea was introduced, it was often introduced within court contexts. With time, it became sort of the goods that you can go to tea shops in London and buy. And initially, those tea shops would be for very elite customers, and you would sit by the counter and you would have a blend of tea leaves tried out to your taste. So you would have a very sort of specific type of blend for your own preferences that would match your own preferences. But over time, and particularly as this sort of mass market for tea developed, then it would come more pre-packaged. Although a fair amount of blending did take place on a wholesale market base. But blending tea is a very complex process, and you need expertise, knowledge to do it. So it also reflects how sort of specialized and differentiated the market for tea was at a very early stage, more so than what I can understand for how the coffee market worked, where there would be, for example, typically in the 18th and early 19th century, Arabic coffee from the Middle East would be the preferred coffee, the coffee beans that were sort of thought of as having the best quality. And with coffee from Indonesia, from Java being the second place, and West Indian coffee being the third and lowest ranked coffee. But across time, you can see again here very specialized markets developing, and particularly in the 19th century for coffee.
You have been studying all this, Hanna, and I'm wondering how do you study this? Is this in old books, or how do you find out how things were so many years ago?
Oh, it's I think there are actually existing catalogs, so you can auction catalogs where you can study how these sort of great huge amounts of tea were traded in Gothenburg. So it's a very kind of a unique series of sales catalogs that covers the Swedish trade with Chinese goods. So that's one source, and it's actually accessible from web pages where you can sort of go and read, and it's annotated so you can see who bought these great amount of tea. But then, and this is not the case for the Swedish company, because the way it was set up, it was quite a secret business, and they burned all their accounts. But in many other cases, like for example with the Danish East India Company and the English East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, you have the company records, which are a vast type of source material. They would write for each expedition, as they would call it, they'll write down every information, the orders they get from the head companies, what to buy, a sort of diary that would cover the journey, and then again a diary that would cover who they traded with, copies of all the contracts they wrote with different Chinese merchants in Canton. And again, back to Europe, they would write a diary for the journey, noting down the winds and the weather and anything else happening on the ship. So that's another type of source material, and that's a type which historians have been working on for a long time. It's often we talk about huge archives, so you need to be many historians to cover this kind of source material. The third type, which I've been working on a lot, is correspondence between merchants who were involved in the trade. Quite often they trade like they would represent the East India Company. There would be what's called supercargos, who would be in charge of the trade in Canton. So they would be personally responsible for sort of writing contracts and making sure that the affairs of the company would be sort of well kept and well executed. But they would also often have like a private trade on the side. So they'll take orders from elite customers in Europe for special types of sort of silk dresses or for porcelain with special designs. And these type of orders would be very lucrative. And then they will also trade with a lot of common goods like tea. So merchant families, often they would have like one member of the family going on the ship, second one being a wholesaler operating, for example, from Göteborg. And then they would often also be engaged in smuggling of different goods, because, as I said, there was this monopoly. But you can go get around the monopoly by sort of smuggling goods and selling them, and because you don't have to pay the taxes, then you can sort of make quite a huge profit. So that's a really interesting, you can get really interesting insights from how the trade worked by looking at the correspondence. And between these types of sources, I think you can get quite a good idea about how the trade worked.
Is even the smuggling documented?
In a sort of discreet sort of way, yes.
To read between the lines.
Yes, I mean, you can, if you know, for example, why quite a few Scottish merchants were involved in the Swedish East India Company and in the smuggling. And they would become Swedish subjects, because then they could insure the goods that they sent over as neutral goods, which during periods of warfare would make the insurance cheaper. So you can sort of understand the logic of the smuggling, or you can see the smuggling if you know how the system worked. You can sort of read between the lines. Yeah.
That is so interesting, and such like a fascinating way and exciting way of studying, to go back like a detective into the past and identify how things worked. I have some questions to Annika here as well, because she has been studying the relationship or the Linné family, and tea was part of their time as well, because it arrived to Sweden during Linné's lifetime, and he gave tea its name. And what more do we know about Linné and the tea?
Yes, we know some more things. He, for example, published a dissertation about the tea in 1765. The system was that there was a student defending this dissertation or thesis, but he wrote them most of the times. And he also talked about tea in his lectures, particularly in dietetics. But then also the Linné's household consumed tea and coffee and chocolate, probably chocolate at least. I'm sure of tea and coffee. So there is a relation, so to say, between the Linné family, the household, and tea. And this is, I would say, rather typical, considered the type of elite they belong to, because, as Hanna also said, it was an elite consumption for a start. It did become more widespread because it became a bit cheaper, but still in the mid 18th century it was fashionable to drink tea and to have like a reception or a party where you actually serve tea and not so much else, perhaps, is a fashionable habit. But this aspect also of both the tea, coffee and chocolate as medicines is very interesting to Linné, and in the dissertation he describes all the medical qualities that tea has.
Mm-hmm. When we look back into the household, what kind of items do we find that suggest that they have been drinking tea?
Well, we have quite a lot of things, actually. There is the probate inventories of the family. They are lists that they made when someone died, listing all their belongings that they had at the time of death. And if we look at both Carl Linné's senior and his wife and his oldest daughter and his oldest son, when they died, they have items connected to tea consumption, and particularly perhaps Linné's senior, Carl Linné's senior, I think he's got like 9 different tables, which is labeled tea table something. Some are a bit bigger, some are a bit smaller. And also we know, because it actually exists still, and there is some correspondence around this, that they had a porcelain tea set ordered from China. As Hanna said, noble families and elite could order specially designed objects from China and from the manufacturers in Canton, and so did the Linné's family. And this, they have both cups for coffee and tea drinking in this set, and it is decorated with the twin flower, which was an emblem to him, of course. So it was symbolically a quite important thing, this. And actually he got one set sent from China, and it turned out that the design of the flowers were not good enough. So the shape and the color were not satisfactory. So he was not happy with this, and he had another set ordered. So it came twice.
And probably took 18 months to get to him.
It did, yes. And also, I mean, of course, when you transport this rather fragile type of goods for such a long distance, it does break. So when it arrives, everything is not in good shape. Some is always broken.
Mm. And Linné had also an interest in trying to grow tea plants. So we have heard a lot that it took a long time to get the tea to Europe, and why not try growing it here? So what do we know about his experiments to try to grow tea, and how did he get hold of tea plants?
Yes, he was interested in trying to, well, he had, you could say maybe a sort of parallel interest here, because he both wanted to try to grow the proper tea in Sweden, and this has got to do with the sort of general economic movement in Sweden and utilitarianism, and the fact that they tried to produce what you needed for luxury consumption in Sweden, so you didn't have to import it. So for that reason, it is interesting to be able to grow tea here. But there is another way to solve this, and that is substitution. So you can also, think of ways of substituting the proper tea for something else that actually grows here. And so they tried to make brew tea from other plants as well. And that was also an interest of Linné's. But the tea plants that he wanted to get from China, and the thing was that he wanted to get the actual living plants, and then they did that on the East India Company ships, and they tried 3 times. I think the first time it fell overboard, these plants, and the second time the roots were eaten by mice, so it died before it arrived. But the third time, a number of plants did arrive, first to Gothenburg, and then, as far as I understand, the wife of the captain of this ship had to travel on land with it, so they didn't risk, to put it on another ship, because normally you would probably have another ship going around to Stockholm or something, but this time she went on land, traveling with these plants, and they did arrive in Uppsala, and some survived. Not very many for some time, so he could probably observe them, and maybe they could harvest some leaves, I don't know, but there was never any Swedish tea production to speak of.
Mm-hmm. What were the other plants that he tried to replace the tea with?
Well, I think Hanna knows more about this, but they did try with the Linné borealis, I think. But
so the twin flower, ironically perhaps, because he used them as decorations on his imported tea set, which he paid, I assume, a fair amount for. But the substitution, which the whole idea, as Annika said, the whole idea with substitution was to reduce import, to have a positive sort of trade balance, and under that flag, or within that context, Linné was, together with other people in Sweden, were trying to develop substitutes for tea as well as coffee and chocolate, actually. But they were most optimistic about tea, and they used. Linné he went on one of his longer sort of Swedish trips or journeys when he went westwards. He describes in the printed travel account from 1746 that he encountered this tea that looked like tea bohea, and it smelled like it tasted it. At least, he said, someone who's not used to the real thing would accept this as a tea taste. But he also talks about how the leaves were sort of, as they were it's infused in water, they behaved like tea leaves, how they sort of looked like tea leaves in water. So in some contexts, he's quite optimistic about this substitution project, but in other contexts, he sort of expresses quite a lot of skepticism around the plants. Instead, I think he really hoped and believed in the possibility of growing tea in Sweden. Mm-hmm. And here he was inspired by how coffee had been relocated, because coffee plants were sort of transported first to Asia and then to the West Indies, and were sort of successfully relocated and used, of course, then in a slave-based economy to produce coffee for European consumers. So that was his sort of prototype. And he had loads of ideas about tea growing in cold areas, similar to the Swedish climate, and it should work, was his assumption.
And you could also mention that they did other similar projects, or had other similar projects like silk. So they tried, and actually I think that was a bit more successful. They had mulberry trees, and they had that in different locations in Sweden because of this acclimatization problem. So in Gotland, for example, and in Skåne, and I think at Drottningholm as well. So they had mulberry trees, and they did actually manage to produce some Swedish silk thread and silk fabric from that. So that was the same type of project. So they had various, efforts like this.
But again, the most successful was tobacco plantations in Sweden in the 18th century, where like tobacco was in the early 18th century, it was the goods that was the biggest sort of import. If you see what Swedish people bought from abroad, tobacco was number one. But over time, the tobacco import decreased because of tobacco plantations being sort of instigated across Sweden. So that was the most successful of these sort of plant transfer projects.
Mm-hmm. And this the trade of plants has been very difficult at that time because, as you mentioned, the travels were very long, and the water was salty in the sea, and it was maybe cold and warm. And it was only a bit later that people developed small greenhouses to travel, or to make plants travel to different destinations. And then it was still difficult to maybe root them there and let them grow out in the wild with a different climate.
And I mean, you can see, like, so Linné was really well connected, and he was a node in the botanical network of the 18th century. But if you see how naturalists operated in states which had more of a colonial sort of stretch, like France and Britain, they used botanical gardens across the world to move plants in between. So you can see Linné being sort of avant-garde in trying to move these plants, and he was not, like, the plant transfer was a sort of common enough, but with time the methods became more sophisticated and the networks more integrated in sort of colonial imperial contexts.
Annika, did you have something?
Yeah, I thought about, all these like commodities we've been talking about, silk and coffee and tea and tobacco and chocolate and so, they were taxed in Sweden also. So there were like sumptuary laws and regulations. So since they were imported and considered luxury commodities, they were taxed. And that's also one way we know that the Linné's household consumed tea and coffee and most likely chocolate, because those taxes were paid by the university. So in the university archives, you can find the information on how much they paid different years for those taxes. So because of that, not only did they have all the necessary equipment for the consumption, but they also actually paid those taxes. So we can be quite sure that they consumed tea and coffee and most likely chocolate.
And even 300 years later, people in Sweden are trying to grow tea. I know of a project in Gotland where people try to grow tea and to make local tea production. So I find this fascinating and very encouraging also to not give up. There may be a way to get it done, to have Swedish grown tea. Yeah, I have some last questions here. To Hanna, you are involved in a project that is called Intoxicating Spaces. Can you tell us a little more about that project and what we can learn about it and how people can visit the outcomes of that?
Yeah, so this is a project that's been funded by a European type of funding called HERA, H-E-R-A. Humanities in European Research Area, and this project was constituted a part of a network in which we collaborated with researchers at Oldenburg University and researchers at the Utrecht University and in Sheffield, and we were sort of studying and comparing the consumption of what we in the project call intoxicants, but it's a fairly well-established sort of category that include these new exotic goods that arrived to Europe in the early modern period. So aside from tea, coffee, tobacco, sugar, opium, so psychoactive substances that the brain reacts to. So these new goods, the sort of starting point is shaped how Europeans and changed how Europeans behaved and socialized. And people, this has been studied in different types of ways. So, for example, we tend to think about caffeine-induced drinks as important for conversations in sort of enlightenment context, for the sort of polite conversations, conversations taking place in public spaces like coffee houses. And this, of course, is true, but it's also worth pointing out that coffee houses were rarely without alcohol. So they would have been places where you would have been drinking alcohol as well as coffee, and you've been smoking. And they were often kind of unruly environments. And the point with the project is to investigate sort of how intoxicants shaped urban life in Stockholm, in Hamburg, and Amsterdam and London, looking at different sort of places and different type of agents. I studied women who were selling coffee illegally in the 1790s, when the Swedish government was trying to reduce import of coffee in order to improve the trade balance. And it's been really exciting to see how kind of category of people that you don't expect take the initiative. Poor women with small children who took the opportunity to make money selling coffee. It was sort of associated with risks. You had to pay a lot of fines, but it could be quite lucrative. So that is the sort of things that we've been studying in the project. And we have a web page, and we'll have a launch of the web page. I don't think the date's set, but sometime in April. And it'll include an exhibition where we sort of show source material from our 4 different cities. So you can compare coffee drinking in the 4 different cities, for example, and tea drinking as well.
Wonderful.
Can I just sort of add or comment that I think it is really interesting that these commodities or also toxic plants or subjects sometimes, it does it did change people's behavior, I think, quite a lot. And I mean, just look at how we consume these things today. Of course, there is a big change. But I also think it's quite interesting when you look at sources like the dissertations of Linnaeus or the lecture notes of Linnaeus, that probably also kind of supported that kind of change, or maybe sometimes it actually is driving the change also, because he is describing quite often how these beverages used to be considered luxuries, but in his time they are not anymore because it's been so widespread, and there might be risks connected to consuming them. He's often, describing the risks and how or the bad sides of the coffee or the tea or so. But he says that it's developed so much and it's so common today, and people don't sort of care about those rational arguments anymore. They will consume it anyway.
And it's quite a modern approach to consumption. It's sort of we can take in that argument. So in a sense, these new intoxicants sort of made us modern in the way we think about consumption compared with earlier periods.
I think this is bringing also this cultural aspect in of how the tea and the coffee and other intoxicants have changed our lifestyle. And I don't think that we are always aware of that. But going into a tea house today where you can eat cake and drink coffee or tea, all of that wasn't possible before tea and coffee and sugar arrived in Europe or in wherever country you basically live, and that is something that is related to this trade. If people wanted to know more about tea and coffee and the story beyond the online exposition, where could they find out more? Do you have books to recommend, museums to recommend, also the story about Linné and the tea? Where can we learn more?
Well, I can recommend a book I've written, which covers the Swedish trade with tea and silk, and where I sort of point to the huge imports, but also the substitution projects. And it's called Silk and Tea in the North, Scandinavian Trade and the Market of Asian Goods in 18th Century Europe. And well, I could recommend also people going and see the web page of the trade catalogs for the Swedish East India Company. They're quite fascinating. You get a sense of how developed this trade was, because I think it's easy to just assume, oh, this is olden days, it must have been very sort of primitive, but it's actually a very sophisticated trade, and they are online. So if people Google Swedish East India sales catalog, they'll find them.
And when it comes to Linnaeus and the Linnaeus family and tea, the dissertation about tea is translated into Swedish, as well as the coffee and chocolate one, and several others. It's the Swedish Linnaeus Society that translates and publishes those, so you can buy them if you want to, borrow them in the library or so, and read them. And they are not like a PhD thesis today, so they are like 20 pages long or so it's not a long text, and they are really interesting to read, so I recommend that. And you can also, of course, go in the Linnaeus Museum in Uppsala or to Linnaeus Hammarby. They are open during the warm season, from 1st of May, I think. And in town, in the Linnaeus Museum, there is a tea table, for example, and parts of the Linnea Borealis tea and coffee chinaware set. And also at Hammarby, you can find some of these cups. And a coffee table, more likely, actually, is exhibited at Hammarby. But at Hammarby, there are also two tins that probably contained tea, metal tins. They probably belonged to Linnaeus Filius, to the son. But they are on exhibition there.
Wonderful. Plenty of possibilities to learn more about tea and coffee as well. Where can people find you?
I work at the Department for History of Ideas and History of Science at Uppsala University. That's where I'm located.
And I work at Uppsala University and Uppsala University Library as visitors coordinator. So I think you would be able to find me via the webpage.
Thank you very much, Hanna and Annika, for sharing all of your knowledge on tea. And it was a very interesting time travel for me from Asia to Sweden and to understand how the tea has come here. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I hope you have enjoyed this episode, and if you did so, please share it. And if you're listening from a platform where you can leave a review or ranking, I would be delighted to get a 5-star review from you. This will help the podcast to be found and make even more people aware of how wonderful nature around us is. If you would like to be updated on future episodes, subscribe to us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or Google Podcast, or whatever your favorite podcast provider is. Or register for our newsletter at www.flora-l.com. Thank you and goodbye.